Hey, welcome to Newsmakers, a co-production between the Epoch Times and NTD. I'm your host, Joshua Phillip.
And I'm Tiffany Meyer.
We start tonight with some big news out of China. Former head of the Chinese Communist Party, Jiang Zemin, is dead. That's according to state media reports coming out of China. Now, Jiang rose to power through the Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989, where he gave firing orders for the CCP military to kill peaceful student protesters. And as unusual rise from mayor of Shanghai to the head of the Chinese Communist Party broke from party tradition, as he had no family history with them. Now, it's believed his role in the massacre had something to do with it.
And he also launched the nationwide persecution campaign against the spiritual discipline Falun Gong, going against the wishes of the other Politburo members at the time. And he declared Falun Gong was a threat to the atheistic rule of the Communist Party and gave orders to bankrupt them financially, destroy their reputations, and kill them physically. Falun Gong is a Chinese meditation practice which is based on the principles of truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance. There were an estimated 70 million to 100 million Chinese people practicing when the persecution began in 1999. The full accounting of those killed under Jiang's persecution is still unknown. Jiang even created an extra-legal body known as the 610 Office to carry out persecutions unheard of in their level of brutality, including live organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience. Under Jiang, the Chinese regime also joined the World Trade Organization, boosting China's economy to the global stage.
And also under him, Hong Kong was handed over from Britain. State media are saying he died of leukemia and multiple organ failure. He was 96 years old. Now, his death comes at an important time for China. People are taking to the streets to protest against the Chinese Communist Party. They're also calling for current leader Xi Jinping to step down. The regime, meanwhile, is responding with arrests, and it's also deploying authorities in medical garments. They call them the Big Whites. Now, CCP police, meanwhile, are going to homes to arrest protesters. Authorities are building large-scale concentration camps, roughly 90,000 people housed in one of them, could be, and under the label also of a COVID camp. Now, the CCP has reached an impasse. Despite the threats of violence and arrests, the Chinese people don't seem to be backing down.
So what does his passing mean, given the current backdrop of protests breaking out across China? And joining us now to help shed light on all of this is China expert and spokesman for the Falun Dafa Information Center, Erping. Erping, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me here.
So to begin, in the obituaries to Jiang, most are actually giving him a lot of praise, crediting him with China's economic rise. So is this the case, though?
Well, I think many people are overlooking some of the things that he has done. As you mentioned earlier, that he came to power because of his contribution to the Tiananmen massacre in 1989. And there are two legacies attributed to him. One is the persecution Falun Gong. The other one is in systematic corruption to sustain the persecution and maintain his power. How did he do that? He allowed different levels of officials at different levels to have different kinds of means to access to wealth. And he also allowed the persecution of Falun Gong overseas. In the history of China, in the history of Communist Party, I should say that the persecution of public intellectuals and even the Cultural Revolution, which was at a great scale, it was all taking place within China. But the persecution of Falun Gong has been extended overseas. So the transnational repression is the first time it's taking place since Jiang Zemin. And Jiang Zemin used 1/4 of GDP to use it against the Falun Gong during the beginning time, the first year of the persecution in 1989 to 1990. So that was a quite massive effort from Jiang's part.
And I'm curious, what's the significance of Jiang's death right now in relation to the protests?
Well, the Chinese netizens actually celebrate his death on Twitter and overseas social media networks because they cannot express themselves freely inside China. We have to also remember that Jiang Zemin, one of his big legacy is that he started the policy of stability above everything, because the society was not stable because of the persecution of Falun Gong, who adheres to the traditional value of truthfulness, compassion, tolerance. And when people who believe good values are persecuted, not only the society lost the traditional values, but the wrong people, the bad people, will get promoted. So the society has been turned upside down in terms of moral values and become very materialistic. And this has been ongoing to this day. Another thing is Jiang Zemin built the Great Firewall of China because he wanted to censor the information about what happened to Falun Gong. When at the beginning, the first year I remember in 1989, the persecution of Falun Gong started. You can still access, Facebook inside of China. But then he realized, because the Chinese people will have, again, the truthful information about what's going on with the persecution, especially organ harvesting in China. So they built this firewall system using $800 million initially to build up this firewall system. Now, today's the facial recognition, the high tech in terms of tracking dissidents, all started with Jiang Zemin. So he has done quite a bit to upset the Chinese people, especially people who wish to access to international internet.
Erping, speaking of the Great Firewall, how do you see Jiang's death impacting that? Will we see the firewall coming down, for example?
Well, this is a catch-22. Well, the Chinese government is beefing up the firewall system. The practitioner of Falun Gong actually had devised two anti-censorship softwares. They were able to send in the links to users in China. Millions of people in China are using this free gate and also auto search through a software to access international cyberspace. This fight on over the internet freedom has been ongoing, but right now we are seeing an interesting trend. That is, the persecution of Falun Gong. About 100 million people are followers of Falun Gong. Has made a lot of the rest of the population. We had 1.3 billion people when the persecution started. Made a lot of people realize that if they distance themselves, then they will not be persecuted, which happened. And then the CCP started waging the campaign of persecution against the underground Christians and the public intellectuals and the human rights lawyers, and then later the Uyghurs. And for the last 3 years, the COVID lockdown has essentially affected everyone, people from different levels, all walks of life. Now if you look at this brief history in the last 20 years linearly, then you see that the CCP really cornered itself with nowhere to go, and this all started with the persecution of Falun Gong.
Yeah, pretty serious stuff. Erping, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Folks, coming after the break, we're being joined by Louisiana's Attorney General Jeff Landry. Now, Landry was one of the officials who questioned Anthony Fauci on his handling of the pandemic. And get this, Jeff says Fauci could not recall key details on COVID-19. We'll hear more from that after the break. Welcome back. Anthony Fauci, head of the NIAID and chief medical advisor in both the Trump administration and the Biden administration, was deposed by the attorneys general of Illinois and Missouri in a lawsuit. And something interesting happened. Fauci seemed to have forgotten most of the key information on his medical decisions.
That's right, we're talking about Anthony Fauci, the health expert who told businesses to close, who told kids they couldn't go to school, who basically said, let's see what happens when we lock people in their homes and flood the economy with government handouts.
Now, thanks largely to Fauci's policies, we've been spiraling into inflation. Record high mental health issues with kids, test scores that are at the lowest levels in 30 years, and he claims now he cannot remember key details on these policies.
And joining us to discuss this is Louisiana's Attorney General Jeff Landry. Jeff and Missouri's AG Eric Schmidt sued the U.S. government in May, a suit that resulted in the latest revelations. Jeff, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So you deposed that Anthony Fauci on November 23rd. Did he really say he couldn't recall the key details of his COVID response?
There were a lot of times when Dr. Fauci made the claim that he couldn't recall key issues when we presented documents, some of those documents being emails that were actually his emails back and forth to different folks that, as they were discussing the origins of COVID-19, and some of the other issues that we went over with him. So we covered everything from the origins of COVID all the way through his response to therapeuticals, to issues in the medical community who were out there basically offering up therapeutical drugs in ways to combat the COVID virus at the time. And of course, this was all based upon the lawsuit that we have, under which basically when Anthony Fauci spoke, Americans were censored by big tech.
Now, I'm curious, why now? Why is it important to depose him? What do you hope to find with all this?
Well, this was a suit that was initiated by General Schmidt and I here in Louisiana, where we sued not only Anthony Fauci, but the Biden administration, the CDC, DHS, the FBI, and the whole suit is based on the premise that the government colluded, co-opted, or coerced big tech into censoring Americans' free speech on social platforms. Because at the end of it all, the government, if the government cannot censor my speech, the government cannot also entice a private actor to censor that speech as well. They can't go in and put someone in the editorial rooms of major media outlets and tell them what they can and can't say on the news. But that's exactly what we believe they did and engaged in, not only in the COVID-19 response, but also in things like the Hunter Biden laptop.
And Jeff, it seems we've recently witnessed the FDA, for example, try to rewrite COVID history by claiming it never prohibited taking ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine. So I get that Fauci was under oath, but do you think Fauci honestly couldn't recall key details, or is he trying to rewrite his own history here?
Well, I can tell you this lawsuit is not going away. We intend to take this to trial. This is going to be one of many depositions that we're going to take. We've been in the discovery phase for quite some time now. Remember, the suit was initially filed in June of 2020, right after the government engaged in starting an agency called the Disinformation Board. Remember that? And so, again, this is part of the problem that we have in America today. This is where the government is going out there and censoring Americans' ability to speak to one another on social platforms, utilizing the social platform in a way to manipulate the American public into a one-size-fits-all policy.
One thing I saw Fauci admitted to in his deposition, China was the inspiration for the lockdowns. Can you elaborate on what that really means for us?
Well, here's what I'll tell you. I can't go into the details of exactly what transpired during the deposition, the specifics about it. However, that transcript we're hoping to make public in the near future when we file it with the court. And then, of course, we'll file the video as well. And then the judge will decide whether or not it will be unsealed. I believe the judge will unseal it. I believe the transcript will be made public. And I think there'll be a treasure trove for folks just like yourself and also members of Congress to go through, where we can hold Anthony Fauci accountable for some of the things that he did during the COVID-19 response.
And Jeff, so Republicans took back the House in the midterm election, and they're saying they plan to go after Fauci. So what might we see from this that we didn't get when Democrats were in charge?
Well, look, I can tell you that I can only just imagine what someone like Jim Jordan's going to do when he gets a hold of this transcript and gets an opportunity to have him and his staff go through it and then subpoena Dr. Fauci over on the House side. It's going to be interesting to see if he can't recall there as well. Again, I think that this is going to be a continual unfolding of one of the biggest collusions between the government and big tech to, again, censor American speech. And again, what we're finding today is that some of the things that Dr. Fauci put in place were not exactly healthy for us. But this was the guy that was in charge of all of our health care, or said he could stop COVID in his tracks a couple of years ago.
You know, back to the point, you mentioned the Disinformation Governance Board, also why you deposed Fauci. What's the significance, if it does turn out that the federal government was basically using Twitter or Facebook or whatever it was as a kind of a medium for government censorship? Why does that matter to us?
Well, it matters because that's the whole premise behind the First Amendment. You know, our founders knew that in order to create a free society, to really have a free nation under which people are free, they had to be able to speak their piece. And they had to be able to do so in the public square without the interference of government of telling them what they could or couldn't say or what they couldn't hear. That's the whole foundation for the First Amendment. That's why this case, I say, is so important. It's probably one of the biggest First Amendment cases in modern times. Because again, if the government can censor through big tech our speech, there is no limits. We're really not free anymore. So it's going to be an interesting case.
Hey, Attorney General, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And speaking of China and us following in their footsteps, coming up after the break, we turn to the protests happening across China. Are people less afraid? And what has changed there? That's coming up after a quick break.
Everything that's reported on television isn't always true, but it should be. NTD, the power of truth. Now available 24/7 on television and streaming platforms.
NTD's Capitol Report. It's about getting answers, cutting through the fog of politics. It's about your questions and our chances to ask.
What is the net impact of the American Congressman Graves? Thank you for joining us.
We're speaking to those in power to find out what does this mean for the people. We're here so you're in the know.
Navigating a world of economic madness, you need to have the right guide. What do today's decisions mean for your tomorrow? We ask why. What's the alternative? Uncover the deeper reasons and the hidden influences, and highlight the real opportunities for profit.
At NTD Business, we connect the dots for you. Good evening. Thanks for joining us. NTD Business. I'm Paul Green.
At The Nation Speaks, we don't just scratch the surface. We want to go wide and deep. our viewers come away with a much richer understanding of the issues of the day. We really make a big effort to bring on different voices onto the show. We don't just talk to experts and newsmakers, which of course are extremely important, but we also want to hear from the American people. So the people who are impacted by the policies and issues that we're talking about, because what they have to say is just as important to the national conversation.
Welcome back to Newsmakers. In the United States, most people have accepted that COVID is endemic and have returned to living their lives.
But in China, the CCP is pursuing a zero COVID policy. Now, they're literally welding people inside their homes. Now,
that's just horrific, and it turns out deadly. When a fire broke out in China's far western Xinjiang region, people welded inside their homes couldn't escape the flames. Officially, at least 10 people have died in the fire. In reality, who knows how many really perished?
People are angry, understandably. And it looks like the fire was the spark that set the rest of the area ablaze. Protests broke out around the country, with protesters now calling for freedom. Some are even demanding that Chinese leader Xi Jinping step down. It's a bold move in China.
In response to the protest, the CCP deployed its riot police. Senior investigative reporter Nan Su joins us to discuss what's happening there. Nan Su, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me today.
Given these protests happening across the country, what has changed to embolden people there to speak out? It seems we haven't seen this scale in decades. So what changed? Are people no longer afraid?
Well, people still afraid. The communist government is the most brutal government machine in the entire history of mankind. So people still afraid of the persecution. But however, it's all this accumulated anger. The anger accumulated all these 3 years on and off lockdown, people being locked down in their home and in their office, in different locations. The entire nation feels like a big jail. Everybody lives their life like a prisoner. So this is just make people fed up. Enough, it's enough. All this anger really driving people, the accumulated anger really driving people come out and take to the street to protest.
Now, on that note, I mean, why is China not willing to lift the lockdowns when pretty much the world is doing that right now? You know, why are they trying to basically live with the virus and instead they're sticking to this whole zero COVID policy?
Well, this is a wonderful question. Now, what happened is in the past 3 years, Chinese government really trying to use this lockdown policy to deal with COVID. Now, what happened is because they almost always lock down, either the building, the community, or maybe the city, even provinces. Generally, overall total infected cases in China, it's kind of like generally speaking, it's lower than the total cases in the Western world. In different Western countries. And the Chinese government has been used the difference in the total infected cases between China and the cases in the Western world as a propaganda machine, the way to brainwash people to promote, see, this is the advantage of the Chinese communist political system. So now, as the world really move away from the COVID, find a way to coexist with COVID, and the communist government really find themselves, they put themselves at a corner. So they want to get out, but while they can't, because if they turn around to learn how to deal with COVID in the Western way, then it's kind of like a backlash to their propaganda.
And it seems the current protests are going beyond just these zero COVID policies, because demonstrators are also calling out and the CCP and for Chinese leader Xi Jinping to step down. Do you see these protests being enough for that to happen?
Not yet. We cannot predict what's going to happen the next. Apparently, right now, you look at all the protests. Apparently, there are different reasons for protesters to join the protest. There are a lot of people joining the protest just because of the anger. just because some of them are financial reasons. This lockdown, people stay their home. Some of them cannot find work, so financially their life is not sustainable. So there was a lot of people protest really just against the zero COVID policy. But while we also see a lot of people, especially young people, students, college students, university students, they come out, they really protest for political freedom. They want democracy. And they even call the Chinese Communist Party step down and Chairman Xi Jinping step down. So you have people with different reasons behind them joining the protest. We don't know what the next move will take place in the protest. Will one of these reasons or of this cause will become the charging statement? I think before more people really realize it's not a zero COVID policy, but it's really the communist government, the Communist Party that's causing all the problem. I don't think it will be enough to make the big change like a Communist Party to step down. But however, things is definitely moving towards that direction.
Well, and given that too, you mentioned two sides to this. On one side, of course, CCP is not going to let go of their policies. On the other side, people are not just protesting against the policy, it's against the CCP itself. What effect will these protests leave in China? How do you see this unfolding?
Well, I think once the protests take place, something is going to change. The entire chemistry is going to change. First of all, people find they will start communicate with each other. They will have less fear, especially the young people. They haven't done this before. They never had this kind of experience before. But now they are out there. They are all together. They start communicating to each other. They will find all of a sudden find. I'm not the only one thinking of this. Other people ask the same thing that I'm asking for. So I think sooner or later, may not be tomorrow, may not be next week, but sooner or later, the protests will be escalated to the next level.
Hey, Nan Su, thanks for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Now, coming up after the break, we're being joined by Tony Cardwell. Tony is the president of the Brotherhood of Maintenance of Way Employees Division. Now, he's here to discuss the threat of a railroad strike and President Biden's response. Don't miss it. We are being censored. America's news outlets no longer provide the truth. 90% of news outlets in the United States are controlled by 6 corporations. They're not out to tell you the truth of what's happening. They're out to tell you the picture of the world that they represent. The Epoch Times is independent. We're not controlled by any special interest, and we never will be. This is a battle between truth and deceit, a battle between forces that would ensnare this country in ignorance, and between a media that wants to present you with the truth. Subscribe today to our digital edition at theepochtimes.com and join the Americans who are seeking truth and tradition. Read the difference on all your devices. We'd love to have you on board.
Good evening. Thanks for joining us.
There's reporting that can be trusted. There are programs that can inspire every generation. There is a television network worth watching and sharing. Our commitment is to bring you the facts and to show you the world. We won't be divided by politics, and we won't be swayed by the dollar. We believe in the strength of our nation and the hope in our shared humanity. We are NTD Television, and we are proud to bring you news you can trust and programs that make you smile. NTD Television, now available 24/7 on television and streaming platforms.
Welcome back to Newsmakers. Now, just in time for Christmas, railroad workers are threatening to strike. And if they do, the economy is going to get worse.
If railroad workers strike, economists warn it'll lead to more shortages and more price hikes and could cost the economy $1 billion in the first week alone.
In response to the railroad's threat, Biden is urging Congress to block the strike via legislation, and union workers are not happy about that.
Joining us to discuss what's going on with the strike and Biden breaking with his usual union allies is Tony Cardwell, president of the Brotherhood of Maintenance of Way Employees Division. Tony, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Tony, your union represents some of the hardest working members in the railroad. We're talking about the guys and girls who maintain the track, bridges, etc., and they want paid sick days. Right now they have 0. And they want at least 4. That's what the proposed strike is over, correct?
That is correct. We have, for 55 years, we've been trying to negotiate sick leave into our agreements, and we've never been able to achieve sick leave. The pandemic exposed a definite problem. Our members were being sent home and quarantined, or when they fell ill, they were home and they were not receiving compensation for the time at home. So our goal is to fight and get sick leave. If an employee gets sick right now and has the flu, he's not able to stay home. He's forced by policy to be at work, and so he comes into work and he spreads that sickness around, and ultimately he doesn't receive compensation if he does stay home, and he can receive discipline for staying home as well. So it's a time that the railroads are going to have to pony up and ultimately give our members some sick leave time throughout the industry.
In most businesses, you do get sick leave, and 4 days doesn't seem like that much. Why is the railroad industry different on this? Why are they not giving people sick days off?
Yeah, ultimately, over 80% of Americans get sick leave, and there's no reason why railroaders shouldn't, particularly if as everyone has deemed railroad workers so vital to the economy. Our labor is highly skilled. The workers that I represent do some of the most complicated and difficult machine operations and physical labor in the business. And oftentimes they work in large groups. They work out in the elements, the cold, the heat, and they get sick. And they should be treated fairly, just like most of Americans, and they're not. So we're going to take this fight to the end. We're hopeful in the Senate that we get the votes that we need. And for the first time in the history of the railroad, we get employees that are going to be able to stay home sick. That's a wonderful thing.
Tony, President Biden says he's pro-union, but then tells Congress to act against the unions and what they're trying to accomplish for their workers. Did Biden betray the unions by telling Congress to pass legislation to block a strike?
Yeah, Biden's not a union negotiator. That's not his job. That's our job. No politician should get involved in our business. Unfortunately, the Railroad Labor Act allows them to do so, and the decision that he made was not a good decision. He should have stood with workers. It would have been tough. It could have caused some potential damage to the economy. There's no doubt. But when working class people aren't being treated fair, there's nothing more honorable than standing up for them and assuring that they get what they need to protect their rights. They're the ones that kept this country in operation, the supply chain moving. They were deemed as heroes and essential workers, and now they went from hero to zero that quick. Biden should have stood with us in this case, and I hope in the future he chooses not to make similar decisions, because if he does, it's going to be a problem.
Now, and I know on the other side, Biden is saying the unions rejected what he said was a good deal, and that's why he turned to Congress. What was wrong with those deals? What happened with those deals?
So they were rejected by our membership. The railroads continue to say that 8 out of the 12 unions have ratified, but the untold secret there is that the 4 unions that are still not ratified make up well over 50% of the membership. And so over 50% of the membership has not ratified this agreement. The problem was sick leave. It's that simple. The number one problem. There's other issues that we would love to improve on, and they will be improved on in future negotiations. But the number one and most resounding message across all crafts was that we cannot get unpaid time. We cannot get paid time off when we're sick. And more importantly than that, we just can't get time off at all for quality of life issues. The railroads have ran what they call the operating system that they use is called precision scheduled railroading, PSR. In PSR, what has happened is we've lost nearly 40,000 workers in the industry in the last couple of years, and so they've reduced the workforce so far back that the employees have to be at work. It's not about money, nor do the railroad carriers care about the money. It's about being at work. They've cut back so far that if one person doesn't show up to work, it causes problems in that area, and ultimately you can't get the trains operational or the crews operational. So because of their cuts and because they run such a lean, demanding operation, they can't afford to have employees off work, so they're forcing them to come in sick. It's bizarre, it's hard to believe, but it's simply true. Railroads haven't denied it either, and so they're gonna have to pony up. People are gonna have to be able to stay home when they're sick, or if they're a single father or a single mother, they have a sick child that can't go to school, things like that. They have to be able to stay home and take care of those situations. That's a quality of life issue that everyone deserves in America, and definitely some of the hardest working Americans, they definitely deserve it. So
on
we'll
that
stand
note,
with the workers.
on that note, real quick, what do you want to see happen?
So look, this is for us. It's not a partisan issue. It's going into the Senate as early as tomorrow, and our expectation is that we get Republicans and Democrats alike to stand with us on the issue. These the 115,000 members that all of the crafts represent are living and working in these representatives' regions and territories. These representatives need to come to the table and stand with us and ultimately give us the sick leave through the legislation and vote for this. We expect the Republicans and the Democrats to stand with the working class Americans and not the duopoly railroads. It needs to change. They need to stand with the blue collar workers and support us on this issue. It's a nonpartisan issue, so we hope to see the Republicans stand and vote with us tomorrow or the next day whenever they do vote, and support our people and support their constituents.
Hey, Tony, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, guys. I appreciate it. You guys have a good night.
And coming up after the break, we're joined by Will Hild. Will was featured in the Epoch Times' new documentary about the multi-trillion-dollar merger between corporations and the government. Their goal, a brave new world of climate and social justice. But Will's company is fighting back. You don't want to miss it.
NTD's Capital Report. It's about getting answers, cutting through the fog of politics. It's about your questions and our chances to ask.
What is the net impact of the American Congressman Graves? Thank you for joining us.
We're speaking to those in power to find out what does this mean for the people. We're here so you're in the know.
Freedom is not free, and neither is the truth. In order to bring you the facts, our reporters are out there on the front lines getting the true story. Some of them served 10 years of prison in China. We've been censored on social media. Our Hong Kong printing offices were set on fire, and we've been repeatedly attacked by the Chinese Communist Party. But no matter what, we believe that you deserve the truth, and so we'll continue to bring the truth to life. Head on over to getepic.com and try honest journalism that is based in truth and tradition. We'd love to have you on board.
It's just clear as day. The media, whether it's broadcast, cable, or print media, has become extremely biased. And I started looking online for alternative ways to get information. And I saw an ad for a free trial. And I looked at it and I said, Epoch Times. I mean, come on, this is end of days type of stuff. I mean, what are they going to be talking about here? And I said, well, it's a free trial. Let me dig in. Is it giving me both sides? Is it giving me an objective point of view here? I have looked for opportunities to see where they might be biased, and I don't find it. It has given me a level of trust in media that I didn't think I'd ever get back. I love the Epoch Times because it has renewed my faith in the idea that a reliable, responsible, non-biased source of information is available. And I can say that I love it because of that.
Welcome back. The world is going woke, or at least it seems that way. Disney's openly admitting it's introducing LBGT programming to its kids shows.
And on top of that, other controversial trends we're seeing are elementary schools introducing drag queen story hours, and some are pushing back.
Yeah, and a lot of people are opposed to this as well. It does not stop with kids. California, for example, is banning new gas car sales, and several other states are doing the same thing.
And did you know Hakeem Jeffries, the guy who wants to succeed Nancy Pelosi, is supporting a commission to study slavery reparations?
On the surface, these issues might seem separate, but they're actually all connected. Now, here to discuss with us is the multi-trillion-dollar merger between the government and corporations is Will Hild. He's executive director of the Consumer First, and Will is also featured in the Shadow State. The Epoch Times documentary takes a deep dive into the march towards the brave new world of climate and social justice. But Will's company is fighting back against the ESG standards. He joins us now. Maybe he doesn't join us quite yet. I think he's having some connection issues. Will, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Consumers First is fighting the growing merger between corporations, governments, and global institutions, specifically regarding health care, a union made possible by something called ESG. To begin, what is ESG?
Well, it's billed by its supporters as a style of investing. It stands for environmental, social governance, and it's the idea that if you take into account all of these basically progressive left factors, that you'll do better in investing over time. What it really is a stalking horse for Wall Street fat cats to push their personal politics, their progressive left politics, into corporate America, and to take the focus of corporate America away from consumers, focusing on consumers and getting high quality goods delivered at a quality price, and instead basically becoming a political utility for the Democratic Party.
Now, how is this merger between corporations and governments impacting, for example, healthcare?
Well, healthcare is one of the areas in which you've seen a huge woke turn. Corporations are being asked to commit more and more to the DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, to the point where you have like the Boston Medical group talking about how they're going to treat patients differently based on their race. So it really is getting down to very insidious levels of effects on corporations.
Will, on Monday, 13 Republican attorney generals filed a motion asking the federal energy regulator to prevent Vanguard from purchasing shares of publicly listed utility companies. Consumer First filed a similar motion against Vanguard. What are you hoping to accomplish?
Absolutely. Well, FERC exists to prevent consumers from paying higher prices because of concentrations of ownership in the public utilities. And that's exactly what's happened here. Vanguard, State Street, and BlackRock now own significant portions of all of these companies. And while they're telling FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, that they are just passive, that they don't push management to do anything, nothing could be further from the truth. These companies specify positions that they want management to take. They've even gone as far as asking for these companies to set retirement deadlines for otherwise perfectly good coal and natural gas power plants. So we're intervening to the point where we're saying, listen, Vanguard and BlackRock, they are not being truthful when they ask for these exemptions, for these thresholds, and it's time that the other side was presented, and maybe these authorizations need to be expired.
Now, in the documentary we mentioned, there's examples of governments using their power to force companies to bend to their will. Canada's government, for example, telling corporations that they would suspend their insurance and even freeze their corporate accounts if their vehicles, for example, used in the Ottawa protests, or like in the United States when the Biden administration told social media platforms that it wanted to shut down particular views it seems overall like there's already a certain amount of cooperation, not just from like the investment level, but between governments and corporations. I'm curious, what's the end goal of this whole shadow state agenda when it comes to all of this?
Yeah, well, their clear goal is to basically turn corporate America into a political utility for the Democratic Party. If you look at ESG, every single agenda item is indistinguishable from the Democratic Party platform, and especially the far left wing of it. So it's anti-human. It is going to decrease our standard of living, increase our cost of living. And that is absolutely the end goal, is basically just to turn corporations into another political utility, the same way they've done academia, the K-12 education space. They want to do the same thing to corporate America.
Will, how do we come back from this then?
It's a great question. Well, you're seeing a huge amount of pushback just in the last 12 to 18 months. BlackRock is under a multi-state investigation by the same number of AG, well, 19 AGs, even more than motioned in this FERC issue. Morningstar, one of the bond rating companies, and you're seeing states sue the federal government as well when they push ESG standards at the OCC or the MSRB. So there is a pushback afoot, and I think next year when we get into the state legislative calendar, when a lot of these state legislatures are in session, you're going to see a ton of anti-ESG legislation passed to start to say, you know, listen, we're a state that relies on oil and gas or agriculture or manufacturing or mining, some of these industries that ESG targets. We are not going to let you use our state's money, our state's pension funds, to undermine our state's economies and our state's jobs. So I think you're going to see in the next 6 to 9 months a lot of legislation pass at the state level. And now with the House switching to Republicans, you're going to see a ton of oversight coming out of, you know, the Commerce Committee, Finance Committee. You'll probably see some antitrust. And there's a ton, we mentioned it, but there's a ton of entanglement between firms like BlackRock and Vanguard and China. So you'll probably see some oversight in that category as well.
Will, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
And coming up after the break, we're joined by Texas Attorney Brent Smith, who's here to discuss Governor Abbott declaring an invasion of the southern border. Is it much ado about nothing, or will it work? We'll find out more after the break.
Welcome back. Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas claims the border is secure FBI Director Christopher Wray disagrees. He said the FBI is working with CPB, seized one vehicle, that had enough fentanyl to kill the equivalent of the entire state of Pennsylvania.
And that's just one they caught. Imagine how many others slip through undetected, or how much is carried across the border. Did you know that during the past 11 months, authorities made more than 2 million immigration arrests along the southern border?
Yeah, and that's a lot. Secure, especially for secure borders, they're saying. And Governor Greg Abbott agrees with me, at least on that. In Texas, he declared an invasion of the southern border.
He did indeed, but Mark Morgan, former acting chief of CPB and senior fellow at FAIR, claims that Abbott's declaration amounts to pretty much nothing.
Now, joining us to talk about this is Brent Smith. He's an attorney in Kinney County, Texas. Hey, Brent, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, Brent, you haven't shied away from publicly criticizing the lack of border security and the horrific impact of illegal immigration really is having a big impact on Texas communities. It seems right now like Governor Greg Abbott is trying to help with this invasion declaration, but now he's getting pushback from Mark Morgan. In his invasion declaration, is it simply just optics, or is it actually doing something?
Well, you know, on the invasion declaration, the language it uses is that it invokes the constitutional authority he needs. But like you and I both know, it all depends on the follow through. What actions actually come after that invasion declaration is done? And Texans are holding their breath and praying that Abbott ends this nightmare for us. So far, I can't see anything actions he's actually taken under that authority yet. You know, we're hoping that he will very soon.
And Brent, Morgan said that for the invasion declaration to mean anything, Abbott needs to give authority to the Texas Department of Public Safety and the National Guard to remove illegal immigrants directly back to Mexico. He claims Abbott must bypass the CBP, Border Patrol, and federal government altogether. Can Abbott do that?
Well, you know, the invasion declaration has nothing at all to do with immigration. It has everything to do with saving lives of Texans and securing the border. Whether it's immigrants or cartels or terrorists that are on the border, what we have to do is repel the invasion, repel people coming across the border. At this point, all of Texas is doing is absorbing it. And we're, you know, like I said earlier, we're hoping that he does that very soon, and he has actions following up with that declaration that does actually secure the border for Texas. And not only Texas, the rest of the United States. The amount of drugs and fentanyl and terrorists coming through across that border, you know, people are concerned about the 9/11 hijackers that came through. We're past that. We have, you know, over 70 or 100 known terrorists that have been apprehended. What about the ones that we don't know about?
It seems like it's becoming a question of state authority, and Abbott seems apprehensive about, you know, testing that limit, it seems. Any idea on why that is?
I think he's concerned about possibly, you know, some type of criminal prosecutions coming after DPS troopers or state prosecution or state law enforcement officials. But, you know, from what I can tell, what the law says, once Governor Abbott declares that invasion declaration, he invokes a constitutional authority to enforce the border. Those troopers are acting under his control and his direction. I don't believe there's anything to worry about there. But that's something that they're going to want to try to take up in the courts, perhaps.
And Governor Abbott put illegal immigrants on buses and sent them to Washington. He sent them to Philadelphia. He also sent them to Vice President Kamala Harris's residence. He publicly said he wants Democrats to understand what Texas deals with, and he got people talking. So what more can Abbott do that he hasn't already done?
Well, you know, I think he was very limited on what he could do prior to declaring an invasion, but that's why it was so important that once he invokes that Article 1 authority, that opens up a whole different type of constitutional, mind you, authority. That means the constitutional trumps state law or federal law. It's constitutional authority that were specifically reserved to the states. Now that he has invoked that, he can do much more than bus immigrants to Martha's Vineyard. He can actually enforce the border and repel entries that come in. That's the thing that needs to go across. The message back to Mexico, Venezuela, and all the other countries, 150 countries have been coming in. Once they get the message that the border is no longer open, they'll stop coming. But right now, they know it's open. Everyone tells them it's open. They see that it's open. That's the problem we have. Until we close the border, and there's only two people that can do that. It's Abbott or President Biden. President Biden is not going to. that means there's one person left to solve the solution, in Texas anyway, and that's Governor Abbott.
On Biden's side, he receives a lot of criticism for publicly welcoming these illegal immigrants. Republicans accuse him of causing an increase in illegal crossings, in part because of his rhetoric, of course, and Governor Abbott is doing the opposite. Do you think he's declaring an invasion to possibly ship illegals back to their country to try to discourage people from crossing into Texas in the first place? In other words, do you think this can actually solve this issue if he does do this?
I believe it'll solve it for Texas. Let's say Abbott does everything he needs to do to secure the Texas border. They will no longer come into Texas, but you still have Arizona and California that they are going to go to. But as a Texas resident, we're worried about Texas first. So yeah, at the end of the day, unless the other states do that as well, they'll just go to the other states where they can still get in. But as far as Texas goes, we're not going to put up with it, and we're done with this nightmare.
Brent Smith, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Despite what we make of Governor Abbott's actions, Texas is doing more than any other state, for the most part, to combat illegal immigration. It's too bad we can't be said for the federal government, but maybe with Republicans controlling the House, we'll see some headway into illegal immigration reform. Not that it could go anywhere with Democrats holding the Senate and the presidency, but at least starts a conversation.
And that's all we have tonight, folks. Thanks so much for tuning in to Newsmakers. See you all next week.
Take care, everybody.